with today's presentation to take those of you who have some lingering doubt about homeschooling, that you may be putting your kids in a fix, and remove some of that doubt. Probably the thematic undergirding of this talk is that everything you've been taught about success in life is pretty much wrong. I want to start with a personal story that will illustrate what the rest of the presentation will be. And we have two 45-minute sessions, but the second one I'll cut short so that if you want to raise certain questions or themes that we can. The idea I'll be arguing here is something I call open source education. Those of you who are in the computer game will recognize the term open source, but I mean it a little more broadly, that you can draw your texts for growing up successfully from anywhere at all. And the teaching is a function. It's not a profession, but a function. Anyone who has something valuable to communicate is a teacher that should be considered part of the palette that you paint your education from. And I want to start with how I first got this idea. I had an uncle I grew up during the Second World War. I know, but it was a good war. I had an uncle who went off to war in 1942. He had been a steel worker and a riverboat employee. The riverboats carried coal from Pittsburgh all the way down to Mississippi to New Orleans. And the people who got jobs on the riverboats were considered a very lucky part of the working class because the food was good and the workday was not onerous. So Bud went off to war as a private in the American Army with a background of being a steel worker and a riverboat worker. He was a tough young man. He looked a lot like John Wayne did in Stagecoach when Wayne was young. But my uncle was a high school dropout. He enlisted to go to war when I was 7 years old. And I saw the troop train carry him off. It's still, I'm 75, a vivid memory in my mind. And somehow or other, because of the personnel needs of World War II, he got a chance to go to officer candidate school. And when he was involved in the invasion of Europe, he was a captain in ordnance, that's the weaponry. Bud was what I called him. In my uncle's platoon, of which he was the commanding officer now, even though a high school dropout, was a man named Al Rockwell. He was a private, and he turned out to be the heir to the Rockwell manufacturing company, which in the States, is a multi-billion-dollar operation. It's vast, it's nationwide, but the family had a democratic tradition, and so the son did not skip military service or wasn't appointed a colonel automatically, but he entered as a private. And so Bud was his commanding officer during a fierce section of battles called the Battle of the Bulge. I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember that, but for a time it looked like the Nazis would drive the invasion back. After the Second World War, my uncle came home and returned to his work as a steel worker. But a year passed and he got a call from Al Rockwell, who now was the head of this vast industrial operation, and he said, "Hey Bud, I want you to come out and be the manager of the plant in Cincinnati, Ohio. It has 11,000 employees scattered over 2,000 acres, and I want you to run the place." And my uncle was never a modest man, but he said, "Well, you know, I actually have not done something like that before." "Hey, it's easy," Rockwell said. "I've got 100 Harvard guys cutting each other's throat. They'll shine your shoes, they'll wash your car, anything to get ahead. They'll do all the work for you. You just sit around and yell at them." And so, inside of 30 days, my uncle went from being a steel worker, you know, all that molten metal being poured, all that good stuff, to being the head of a vast industrial operation. And I got to see that firsthand when I was a junior in high school, because he called me back around Pittsburgh and said, "You know, it's time you stop being a parasite on your parents and made your own money. I want you to come out here to Cincinnati and work for me." He said, "Naturally, because I'm the boss and you're my nephew, you'll have to work twice as hard as the paid employees, because I can't look bad in front of these people, all these Harvard graduates." "What will I do?" I asked. I weighed about, 150 pounds then. He said, "From 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, you're going to load 125-pound pigs of cast iron onto boxcars. Then you go home, you go to sleep, you wake up the next day, and you'll do that all day long, month after month." "Oh, well," and he said, "You'll be paid like a man." That appealed to me. So then I learned a lesson which didn't become manifest to me till many, many years later, that all the careful categorization and specialization that we believe excludes us from doing all manner of things is a sort of an illusion. It isn't that specialized knowledge doesn't exist. It's that it's thin enough in every area that you can float between these different undertakings, as long as your mind is open and you learn all the time. Okay. If you Googled an American magazine called Fast Company for November 2007, you'd find yourself staring at the cover, the homely face of a junior high school dropout, a fellow named Jonathan Goodwin. How does a young fellow from a poor Kansas farm family rate such cover model treatment? No high school, no college. Well, after bailing out of junior high school at age 13, Jonathan did odd jobs at a local garage for pitiful pay. Now, be Jonathan's mother for a minute. This is a sad story, right? No future in that. That was my school, he told the magazine. When the price squeeze in gasoline came, it puzzled young Jonathan because it seemed phony to him. He knew from puttering around with internal combustion engines that the technology had existed for 50 years or more that could give cars 60 to 100 miles a gallon and push emissions near zero. He wondered why Detroit wasn't using it. No matter, Jonathan said to himself, at age 16, with not even a junior high school education, I can build it myself. And before you could say, crazy kid, he had more business than he could handle. He could get 60 miles a gallon out of a Hummer. And he said 100 is possible, but it just takes too much work to do the conversion. But to convert your Hummer to get 60 miles a gallon instead of 7 or 8, he charged $25,000. And his biggest and best customer was Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California and also the movie actor. He converted 7 Hummers for Schwarzenegger. I don't know why Schwarzenegger would want 7 Hummers, but he had them. He's taking in now, he's in his middle 20s, about $1 million a year. He does 4 conversions a month. Before Jonathan was old enough to vote, he was a self-reliant human being adding value to the community. Tell your kids that the name of the game is figuring out how to add value to the community around you. If you can do that, doesn't matter how old you are, what color you are, what your school grades are, you will do quite well for yourself. When Jonathan left 7th grade, he was just 1 year older than America's first admiral, David Farragut. At the age of 12, Farragut took command of a captured British ship off the coast of Peru in the War of 1812, and he sailed it to Boston with the British crew below decks, and because Farragut was a gentleman, he let them keep their weapons. How about that for a civil war? He was the same age, Jonathan, now, as George Washington was when he dropped out of schooling entirely. He was the same age that America's second president, Thomas Jefferson, was when Tom began to manage a large plantation and 250 employees in Virginia, both his parents being dead. And the same age you and I were once, sitting at our school desks, copying notes from the blackboard and getting yelled at. The reason I think that history has been eclipsed in schooling in the large industrial countries is that the lessons of the past are far too inconvenient for the managers of society to have getting around. For most of human history, everywhere you went on the planet, you were not a boy or a girl at age 12. You were a man and a woman, and you were expected to carry your share of the load. Now, whether you agree wholly with that or partially or not at all, I can guarantee you that if you expect your children to carry their share of the load and not to wait in abeyance to take their turn, you will see marvelous changes take place in your kids. On April the 20th of this year, a young woman named Danica Patrick became the first woman in big-time auto racing history ever to win a major event. She was driving against the two-time Indy 500 winner, Helio Castroneves, and she roared past him in the final 2 laps of the Motegi Japan 300. All 100 pounds of her roared past him, and she won going away. This is about finding something you love and following through with it, she told reporters after the race. 10 years earlier, Miss Patrick had dropped out of high school, made her own way alone to London, where the only course in the world is given that teaches you to sustain speeds above 200 miles an hour for hour after hour after hour. I hope there's no cops in here, traffic cops. Anyway, she went to London on her own, learned to sustain speeds above 200 miles an hour, and came back to the States, and now she has taken her first major triumph. For years, she's been making several $1 million a year as the only woman in big-time auto racing. She does commercials. I have a neighbor in New York City who I've never met, but he lives near me. His name's Nick Schulman. He's 21 years old as I speak to you here. If I had stayed in school teaching, it's very likely that Nick would have been in my junior high school, maybe in my English class in 8th grade. Although he probably wouldn't have been there very long, because it was in 8th grade that Nick began to cut school almost every day to play pool. Not a good sign, right? Eventually, Nick gave up pool playing because he found computer games, and I'm sure some of you have kids, maybe you yourself, become addicted to playing Grand Theft Auto or whatever the game of the moment is. At age 18, in 2005, Nick became a poker addict. Pity his poor mother, right? When other kids were worrying about standardized exams in college, Nick was worrying about straights and flushes. On February the 28th of this year, Nick won $2 million on the World Poker Tour. Now that the problem of paying rent was taken care of, he told the newspapers, "I'm ready for a different kind of fulfillment. This is the school dropout, the pool player, the computer games player. I'm ready for a different kind of fulfillment." Academic philosophy is what Nick has his sights set on now. You know, Kant, Hegel, Plato, those kind of guys. And for that, he plans to enroll in college. That's where you probably were at 21 too, but without the $2 million. If your teenage daughter changed her name to Diablo, you might shrug it off as a passing fancy, right? Imagine your kid Fiona. She says, "I'm Diablo from now on." But if she came home one day and said her life's ambition was to be a stripper, you might worry a little, right? And what if she set up a pornographic blog? I can't even repeat the name of it because of my age and the mixed company here. And all sorts of strange phone calls began coming to your home. In her mid-20s, Diablo Cody, now a lap dancer, published a book about her degrading work. It was called Candy Girl, and I'll bet your librarian can get it for you. It's well worth reading. Whatever you think about the dark side of lap dancing, you don't know half of it. It is as degrading a business as it's possible to be in. Now she's 25 years old. And yet, this year, at the Hollywood Oscar ceremonies, 2 years after she published Candy Girl, Diablo Cody appeared to accept her Oscar. She had a cut to the thigh leopard print gown. She had a tattoo of a stripper starting on her shoulder and running all the way down her side. But she had written a movie called Juno, which, if you haven't seen it, is an excellent film, just excellent. But a young girl who has a baby out of wedlock and ignores the advice to have the kid aborted, puts the kid up for adoption. So Diablo Cody would have been unpredictable, right, from any of her resume, starting with changing her name to Diablo. That's bad news. Every track she left behind seemed to lead to destruction rather than to an Oscar at age 27. I'm talking about people who accepted the obligation of educating themselves through an open source system. Jonathan, Danica, Nick, Diablo each took an open source road to an individualized education under their own personal management, exactly as Benjamin Franklin in the States once did. Open source learning accepts that everything under the sun might be a possible starting point on the road to self-mastery and a good life. Could be garage work, could be poker, could be lap dancing, whatever. In open source learning, sequences are personally designed and they're personally signed off on. And everyone you encounter is a potential teacher, a garage mechanic, a card sharp, a lap dancer, a race car driver, everyone. Potter Stewart, once a United States Supreme Court justice, remarked that he couldn't define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it. Open source learners are like that. To hedge it in with official formula is to ruin it. But I owe you at least a rough abstract of the thing. In open source, as I told you, teaching is a function. It is not a profession. Anyone with something to offer can be a teacher. The student determines who is or is not a teacher, not the government. In open source, you do not need a license to teach any more than Socrates did. Right there you can feel how different the basic assumptions of open source are. No student faces failure for deciding not to learn from you. In open source, students are the active initiators. It all sounds too undisciplined, I know, but life beyond schooling is exactly like that. You either write your own script or you become an actor in somebody else's script. The Financial Times of March the 17th, 2006 tells the story of a silent contest between highly trained college executives and engineers and a band of Chinese peasants. Since the account has real bearing on the idea of open source learning, let me summarize it for you, and I hope it shocks you a little bit. Not long ago, about 8 years ago, the ThyssenKrupp Steel Corporation of Germany decided to unload its mighty Phoenix steel plant in Dortmund on China. Steel prices were way down, and it looked to management as if they were going to stay down And they said, let's just dump this place, all 220 acres of buildings. Of course, that would throw 10,000 Germans out of work, but hey, that's business, right? Management expected 2 fat payoffs, one in the sales price, one in the bill to move the plant from Dortmund to near Shanghai. Tyson estimated it would take 3 years and an army of specialists to do that. China bought Phoenix, but they choked on the moving bill. They said they would do the job themselves. Fat chance, right? It took highly trained specialists. One fine day, a raggedy band of 1,000 Chinese peasants, led by a peasant farmer named Shen Wenrong, showed up in Dortmund, Germany. Here's a capsule of data to help you think about Mr. Shen. He did not use a computer. He did not work out of a real office. He worked from behind something that looked suspiciously like a kid's school desk. He had no secretary. Shen's first computerless, officeless, deskless decision was not to pay German housing costs or food costs. He set up a commissary and dormitory housing in 3 weeks. Then the Chinese peasants broke the steel plant down, crated it, shipped it, they had never done this before, shipped it to China, uncrated it, and set it back up inside of 1 year, not 3. Numerous rules were broken in the process, where ever more creative problem solving seemed appropriate. In the time it took to move Phoenix, China's huge orders for steel on world markets drove prices through the roof, exactly as China had calculated was going to happen. Phoenix in China was a big moneymaker right from the beginning, just as it would have been if it had been left in Germany. So the ignorant Chinese not only worked harder than the Germans, they had better judgment. How were we ever tricked into believing that specialists are needed for matters well within the reach of ordinary people? How did we come to think so little of ourselves? If unschooled peasants can demolish and re-erect a steel plant 3 times faster than professionals, then you and I need to re-examine everything we've been carefully conditioned to accept as truth. I mean, everything. That examination is called dialectical thinking, and dialectics was central to schooling before the government took it over. We don't teach it anymore, not even to the so-called gifted and talented. And now the title section of this talk, Walk About London. High school dropout Richard Branson thinks the most important lesson of his life happened at the age of 4, when he was the son of a single mother who was an airline stewardess. So they got by, but they didn't get by with much to spare. It was a London walkabout that changed Branson's life and propelled him to the 22nd wealthiest person on the planet, and a man who's just completed building a spaceship. The New York papers before I left were full of Branson's picture standing next to his spaceship. He sold the seats for $250,000 apiece. They're all gone, so eat your heart out if you wanted to go into space with Branson. Anyway, he tells the story of a London walkabout he took at his mother's orders when he was 4 years old. Sort of recreate a 4-year-old in your mind. Some of you won't have to recreate it because you have. How old is that little person? How old? 3.5? Could you hold? Is it possible to hold? Branson was 6 months older than that little person when what changed his life occurred. Here's how it happened. 4-year-old Richard was on a drive with his mother, Eve, in the London suburb of Shamley Green, miles from home, in an area where Richard had never been before, when Eve pulled over and asked him whether he thought he could find his way home alone from where they were. He said yes, whereupon she told him to get out and do so then. And she drove off. She didn't drive off and then spy on him. She drove off. Mother was determined to make us independent, he told in his autobiography in the New Yorker magazine in May of last year. By age 12, he was making 100-mile round-trip bike rides to the beach at Bournemouth. After a brief go at high school, he dropped out. He never spent a day in college. He never took makeup exams to get one of those mail-order high school diplomas. At age 19, he had his first successful business, and Virgin Airlines, his music business, and many others lay in the future, as did his private spaceship, which is complete. On July 29, 2008, a picture of Branson and his mother Eve and the completed spaceship was on the front page of newspapers all over the world. All the seats had been snapped up. Is 4 years old too young to become involved in serious business? It might be pretty long in the tooth, because if you have access to YouTube, you can find a film of 2-year-old Tiger Woods sinking putts on a television show, doing a pretty good job at 2. And later, of course, he dominates the golf world. I remember sitting in the office of a man named Glenn Doman in Philadelphia about 20 years ago, looking at framed tributes all over his walls from the famous of the planet, like Jackie Kennedy, because Glenn had taught their babies to read and to do the arithmetical operations, multiplication, division. Glenn explained to me how easy it was to teach a baby to read, count, and do the basic arithmetical functions. They learn instantly, he said. The trouble comes if you wait until they're 5 years old, or if you spend too much time in review. Is that what schools are about? Too much time in review? Every year you delay, he told me, increases the magnitude of difficulty. Doman has sold 3 million copies of his book, Teach Your Baby to Read, although you're not likely to find a single copy in any school in the world for obvious reasons. I went to visit Doman for an odd reason. My daughter, who was at this fancy university called MIT, told me he was the laughing stock of her friends. I'd never heard of the guy. She told me in a phone call from Boston. And the minute we finished speaking, as is my habit, I dialed Philadelphia information, got Doman's number, and rang him up. I'd never heard of him to that moment. I asked if I might come out and visit to see this alleged miracle for myself. What are you doing this evening, he said. and an hour later I was driving to Philadelphia, where I met him in the late evening, stayed in his guest bedroom, and next morning watched his school in operation. His school was formless in this sense. He didn't recruit students. Any mother that wanted to learn how to do this, he would take in with her children for 3 months. So they were all different ages from all parts of the country. No one knew one another, and Glenn undertook to teach the method of communicating these skills in 21 days, not 12 years. While I was there, I watched 7-year-olds reading real books, not Dick and Jane or C-Spot Run. He took anyone who applied to the school, and impromptu, the kids put on a scene from the Mikado for my pleasure, complete with song and dance. They couldn't have known I was going to be there. I left with a heightened sense of just how far official schooling has dumbed us down. Branson's successful walkabout, the dirt farmer savvy of Mr. Shem, are only possible to people with access to the classroom of the greater world. All my life, I've been saturated with warnings how people without diplomas, certificates, and credentials are ruined, doomed to insignificance. I know you've been warned too. So how are we to account for George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, America's two best presidents, having almost no school at all between them, maybe 3 years? How to explain America's two legendary industrialists, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, both having dropped out of elementary school? I mean, why didn't school matter in their day, but it does in ours? Is this open source thing feasible in modern high-tech society? If you think not, you're going to have to tell me how we got the human genome mapped from a horrible student, a surfer bum from Southern California named Craig Venter, who graduated with a D- average, but actually had an all F average. They raised his grade to D- to get rid of him. He was such a rotten human being. And a born-again Christian homeschooler named Francis Collins, who studied whatever he wanted to growing up for as long as he wanted to study it. And he had no background in science at all. Collins, that's the born-again Christian, told the New York Times a few years ago that the Virginia school authorities would have thrown his mother in jail if they had known what school looked like in the Collins home. Now, the next bit of evidence I have to present to you is my absolute favorite, that a large part of credentialism and specialization is some kind of con game. This has a great deal of humor to it because it takes place at MIT, where my own daughter graduated, having bankrupted the family. She didn't do it, MIT bankrupted the family. On April the 27th, 2007, so we're talking about 17 months ago, something like that, national headlines announced that MIT had fired its famous director of admissions, Marilee Jones. She was dismissed in disgrace after 8 years of outstanding service, during which MIT granted her its highest honors, and she became the most famous college admissions director in the United States, probably on planet Earth. So how come she was fired last April? She specialized in female recruitment for a high-tech school. Not an easy sell, but during her tenure, she tripled the number of women at MIT, including catching my daughter. I said, don't go to MIT. It costs as much as Harvard, and you end up working for somebody who graduated from Harvard, but you know daughters. Jones specialized in female recruitment. At the time of her dismissal, the press quoted students and faculty with characterizations of her service ranging from beloved to irreplaceable. So why had she been canned? She had to have been molesting students, right? Or something really serious like that. No, if I gave you 1,000,000 years, you could not guess why she was dismissed. Some snoop had gone back to her records, probably somebody who wanted to be the admissions director, and checked out her references, and they discovered that she did not have the 3 college degrees she claimed, but instead, this is inconceivable, she had been a country western nightclub singer in upstate New York. Now, why somebody doing a wonderful thing like country western nightclub singing would wish to be the admissions director at MIT, I don't know. But Marilee Jones wished that, and her wish was granted. She did add that she had 3 college degrees, but other than that, she did a spectacular job in this so-called highly specialized profession. MIT's chancellor told the press, such a mistake, he said, would never happen again. No more nightclub singers. In the future, he said, you can almost hear him clearing his throat, in the future, we will take a big lesson from this experience. When I read that, I asked myself, what lesson could possibly be learned from throwing away a brilliant colleague whose worth was proven, not theoretical? Was the lesson that doing a sensational job is insufficient job protection? The lesson for me was that the president of MIT should have been fired. Degrees should never stand as proxies for education because they never are. Think only of a man that all of you know indirectly. His name is Ingvar Kamprad. He was diagnosed as dyslexic by the school experts of Sweden. There was no point in him continuing because his head was too screwed up to learn anything. So he began independent life selling fish from a bicycle. I don't quite know what would be harder to do than having a guy pedal up to you with a fish, want to buy a fish. I realize there's probably some different interpretation of selling fish from a bicycle. Bit by bit, Ingvar added items to his bicycle. He added matches, that's a big money maker, I guess, and Christmas decorations. You don't want to fish? Well, how about some Christmas decorations? What a hard life. I'm afraid some of you might think that his life would have been better if he had gone through several colleges and become an investment banker. But as his line of merchandise grew, a powerful idea began to drive dyslexic Ingvar. He wanted to create a business that would bring beauty and utility into the lives of ordinary people at a low cost. This dyslexic fish peddler is worth $31 billion at the moment, and more important than that money, which he'll never live long enough to spend, the flame of his determination to add value to the lives of others through his store IKEA still burns brightly. You're on the road to becoming educated when you know yourself so thoroughly that you can write your own script instead of taking a part written by others. When you can say to yourself, I think I'll take a horse and wagon and ride it around the world, then you're educated. And I want to tell you about a migrant fruit picker. I don't know if you have those in Scotland, but the fruit and vegetables in the United States are picked by transient workers, mainly from Mexico and Central America, who come in, are abused, or paid almost nothing, pick the fruit and vegetables, and then go back home. I want to tell you about a highly educated migrant fruit picker. His name is Charles Webb. And I'd be surprised if at least some of you hadn't consumed a piece of Mr. Webb's imagination, if not his fruit. If you ever saw the American classic film, The Graduate, did anyone ever see that? If not, please rent it, especially after you hear his background. The Graduate was the iconic film of teenagers and college students during the 1960s. It was about a well-bred young woman of money who ends up fleeing the church at her wedding to a moneyed young man, fleeing the church with some young bum dropout. And they race off into the sunset to who knows what kind of a life, but she preferred that kind of a life to marrying into a moneyed family in which every movement is predetermined, really, from the moment of the marriage until death. You don't dare deviate from the script very far, or you're drummed out of the fraternity. Anyway, he wrote this film, The Graduate. First, he wrote a book that sold millions of copies. Then he did the film, The Graduate, and his film became a beacon to an entire generation of young people. Its theme was that a life built around buying things is a disaster. The Graduate is still shown in the States and rented decades later. Charles and his wife made $25 million. Wow. They were on every 18 guest list, from Maui to East Hampton. And as their life turned into the non-life of perpetual celebrity and celebrity projects, Webb and the Misses made the copyright over to the Anti-Defamation League, gave their entire fortune away. They gave it all away, all the $25 million, and they set out in a trailer as vagabonds. They became migrant fruit pickers in California. Wealth didn't work for us, Charles Webb said. Every single day in America, 7,000 students drop out. Some confused, some angry, but all of them brave. If we had the same sense our ancestors did, we would look on these dropouts as a great resource, as people whose minds standardized programming could not tame. We'd treat them with respect. 1.25 million young people a year in America, perhaps more, with potential not necessarily inferior to the dropout Richard Branson or the dropout Wright brothers, who may or may not have invented the airplane, or the slum urchin Lula da Silva, grown to the presidency of Brazil without any certificates or diplomas, and on the verge of making Brazil the first major nation absolutely free of petroleum. That will happen next year. What does it say to us that 1.25 million young people a year in America don't want to be in classrooms and don't want to be there so much they're willing to endure insults, scorn, and constant discrimination as the price of escape? Are they just unfortunates who have earned their future misery? Or is it we, the self-imprisoned and perpetually frightened, waving our wallets and our homes in the suburbs as evidence we must be alive, who are the truly miserable? Year after year, the International Happiness Survey ranks our country, that's the U.S., but your country too, as among the least happy, along with Germany and every other Anglo-Saxon country. Does the phony pecking order created by degrees and by elite colleges have anything to do with this? If things were really as we've been conditioned to believe, how could a slum urchin govern a complex modern nation? How could the lower middle class semi-urchin Adolf Hitler have risen to command the best schooled nation in human history? How could Thomas Edison have dropped out of elementary school, gone 1,000 miles from his home to the west, all alone with no money, no contacts, at age 12, and by age 23, have founded General Electric, and by age 15, have 4 separate streams of revenue? He was making about 4 times what a skilled workman could have made at age 15. And the London Times reporter put him on the front page of the paper. He was running a newspaper out of a moving train with a broken down printing press and making very good money selling the paper at the train stops. The London Times, this back in the 1860s, said it was the first a Guinness record. But it wasn't even a Guinness. So if school were the life and death matter you've always been told it is, how could George Bernard Shaw drop out of school at age 14 and teach himself to be the greatest dramatist of the 20th century? Why has no school, no college, no politician, no newspaper ever connected the dots for you the way I just did? All of these facts are part of the public record. It's the connection of the dots that gives them, I think, their overwhelming power, at least enough power to have you question whether following a regulated official curriculum means your son or daughter any good. 6 more minutes and you get a break. In 2006, the University of Connecticut set out to discover how much learning happens in a student between entering college as a freshman and graduating as a senior. That's an interesting project, right? They picked 5 academic areas. They picked 14,000 students at 50 American universities. So there's a lot of money behind this study, including Yale, where George Bush went, Brown, where Jimmy Carter's daughter went, and Georgetown, which is where Bill Clinton went. At 16 of the 50 colleges, let me let a second lapse. At 16 of the 50 colleges, including Yale, Brown, and Georgetown, graduating seniors knew less than incoming freshmen. That is a key to your freedom. Do less, 16 of the 50. In the other 34, there was no measurable difference. In other words, after spending an average of 6 years in search of a BA degree or its equivalent, and spending an average of $250,000 in cash and loans, a great many young people had either nothing or less than nothing to show for the investment. I just loved it. What they had was a piece of magical paper through which politically they could demand privilege. And yet there's so many of those magical pieces of paper out there now that it's not working for a lot of people who have that piece of paper. There isn't privilege enough to distribute to them. The next one, if some of these other stories, all of which are verifiable, immediately verifiable, if some of these are unbelievable, the next one may be the most unbelievable of all. On April the 13th of this year, May, June, July, 5 months ago, the American television show 60 Minutes reported that a heretofore unknown method of killing cancerous tumors had been invented by a cancer patient with no background in science and no college degree. The Nobel Prize-winning cancer researcher Rick Smalley said on the show that it was the most impressive development he had ever seen in his life and that it would change medicine forever. The guy's name, John Canzias. His method destroys tumors without chemotherapy, surgery, familiar radiation, or diet. He had taken 36 rounds of chemo, and he was desperate enough to rack his brains for something which the profitable cancer empire might have missed. And he found such a thing in memories of his boyhood hobby as an amateur radio buff, you know, these shortwave things. By accident, when he was a boy in his family garage, he had discovered that when radio waves go through metal, the metal heats up. And he wondered, it gets very hot, he wondered whether if the tumor was shot full of metal particles, the radio waves would kill the tumor and not touch the other tumor. So instead of having a laboratory and lots of lackey assistants around him, all he had to test his theory was a hot dog. And he shot the bottom of the hot dog full of metal particles. Then he put radio waves on, and the bottom of the hot dog cooked, and the top of the hot dog remained perfectly cool. He took his invention to 2 university laboratories. They ran preliminary tests and said it kills tumors, but it does no damage at all to the surrounding tissue. Only the part that has the metal particles in is damaged. So, from his childlike hobby that probably drove his mother insane, this invention that was called very recently by a Nobel Prize winner the most impressive that he had ever seen was discovered. No formula known to any of us could have predicted John Canzias and his hot dog. How many more John Canziases are out there denied a voice in our synthetic anti-meritocracy, which awards privileges on the basis of college degrees and family connections? Is there one more John Canzias, 10 more, 10 million more, or an inconceivable number? I think the latter. Listen, friends, if peasants can deconstruct steel mills and torch singers can revolutionize admissions at famous colleges, and junior high school dropouts can get 100 miles to the gallon, and beach bum surfers can map the human genome, and tiny women can blast through the male monopoly of big-time auto racing, and dyslexic fish peddlers can establish global merchandising empires, and lap dancers can win Oscars for script writing. Some vitally important piece is missing in the conventional way that schools treat learning and accomplishment, and missing in our own understandings too. That's part one. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in 10 minutes. You might recall that in the first half of this presentation, I tried to dispel the fear that high-tech science was inaccessible to people through an open source learning system by bringing the example before your attention of the two creators of the Human Genome Project, which is the premier scientific project on planet Earth today. One was a D- school student who cut school constantly to go surfboarding, and one was a born-again Christian kid who studied anything he wanted for as long as he wanted. The only interference his mother made was he had 3 brothers, all different ages, and they had to all agree when to start some undertaking and when to stop it. Otherwise she would intrude, but she never had to. I want to go back to the beach bum who gave us the Human Genome Project, Craig Venter. He was born in 1946, and he found school exquisitely boring, and he took vengeance on the teachers by driving them crazy. He cut class often to hit the boogie board, and only escaped junior high school because his his F's were changed to D- so the school could get rid of him. He then enlisted in the Navy as an ordinary seaman, and he rose to be a medical corpsman in Vietnam. I was a medical corpsman in the Korean years. And there he learned to despise bureaucracy, because when people are having their hands and their ears blown off, you don't want to hear about rules about morphine or anything else. So he despised bureaucracy, and in his autobiography, was just published about 4 months ago, it's called A Life Decoded, and I would be certain it would be right over at Borders in Aberdeen. In A Life Decoded, he fills in details about his life that I think you'll find interesting, because who could have ever predicted that this beach bum would be a candidate for scientific immortality just 10 years after he had been a bum. Could Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president who served 4 terms and established the welfare state in the United States, have been predicted from his C average in high school and his C average in college? Could George W. Bush, who has established a policy of first attack, an inconceivable moral failure, that we can attack anybody we decide to attack. Could he have been predicted by his C average in high school and his C average in college? Perhaps. The man that Bush defeated for the presidency, John Kerry, had a C average in high school and a C average in college. The Latter-day Saint being celebrated for his green film, An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore, which I seriously doubt if he had anything to do with the film other than put his name on it. I'm sorry I was sarcastic there. Gore flunked out of his first college and graduated from his second with a C- average. U.S. global computer dominance came almost exclusively from men without college degree. Bill Gates, no college degree. His partner, Paul Allen, no college degree. Steve Jobs of Apple, no college degree. Steve Wozniak of Apple, no college degree. Michael Dell, no college degree. Ted Turner, the founder of the International News Network, dropped out of college his freshman year and said it was a waste of time. William Faulkner, one of America's few Nobel Prize winning authors, had high school grades too horrible to make him eligible for a bad American college. But after he served as a flight officer during the First World War, the college gave him a waiver and allowed him to enroll, and he promptly got a D in English. This is our Nobel Prize winning author, and he dropped out in disgust, never to return again. Warren Avis, the man who pioneered auto rentals at airports after the Second World War, had enough money, a little bit, to go to college or start a business. He debated which to do and decided college would be a waste of time, and he never looked back. And of course, Avis and its imitators are all over the world now. The United States' largest mail-order book dealer wrote a letter to me and said the advantage he had over his competition in dominating mail-order books was that he hadn't wasted his money or his time on college. Paul Orfalea, the highly intelligent founder of Kinko's, copy shops, which when I speak in Asia, there's always a Kinko's somewhere near, was regarded as so dumb by his high school that it told his mother not to waste her money, that he would be a hopeless failure in college. Sean Fanning, who as an 18-year-old fellow invented Napster and almost ruined the international commercial music industry with that invention, was hired last year by that industry for $7 million to design a plan to save it. Sean had no college degree, and he said recently he has no plans to get one. The man who created modern Hollywood, which is one of the few ways the United States has to make money around the world, lousy hamburgers and you know, movies, had no college, and he had no seat time in a high school. Did he go to high school by mail order, the way they do sometimes in Australia? No, he did not. He made a deal with the high school principal that if he didn't have to go to high school, what he would do, he was a movie usher. He cut school to make a little bit of money and see the movies free. If the principal would give him a diploma anyway, Wasserman said he would temporarily steal the first-run Hollywood movies that were coming into his movie house before it opened, run them over to the high school where the principal could show the movies for a nickel, make enough money to buy band uniforms and football equipment, and then the mothers would love him. And then Wasserman would run the movie back before it opened in the late afternoon. That was Lou. What did he use his time for that he stole from high school? Thinking about the entertainment business and thinking that the soft spot of entry to big-time work in that industry was through the contracts that exploited the actors and actresses. And as a teenage boy, he worked tirelessly on contracts, and then he would approach people like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and he would say, "Let me represent you." As a teenage boy, here's the contract I'll get them to sign. Those contracts that he created as a teenager are still used in law school to teach entertainment law. You see what I mean about the artificial extension of childhood. If you haven't made some kind of an impact on the world by the time you go off to college, the chances you will make an impact are so close to zero that first-rate colleges in the States like Harvard or Yale or Georgetown won't accept you unless your dad agrees to give a building to the college. Now I want to talk about a man that all of you know, Warren Buffett. We saw a 3.5-year-old earlier today in this corner waving a British flag in Scotland, an English flag, and we saw a 12-year-old up here. I want to talk about 6-year-old Warren Buffett. So he's like a happy medium between those two. Buffett grew up in Omaha, Nebraska during the Great Depression. Not a lot of money around. At the age of 6, Buffett set up a business that was very profitable. He sold ice-cold Coca-Colas door to door in baskets, and he'd make a penny profit on each, so he never came home with an unsold Coca-Cola, because those were the days before air conditioning. But by the age of 7, Buffett knew the business inside out. He had no more to learn from it, so he hired a kid and gave the kid a half a penny a bottle, and Buffett now had a stream of income. And what then did Buffett do? Well, at the age of 8, he was told by somebody that a lot of golfers will hit the ball into the deep rough and not go and look for it, and the ball might be almost brand new. Or they'll hit it into a water hazard, they'll sink to the bottom, there'll be piles of them down there. Buffett made a deal with the club professional that he would bring in baskets of these balls, and the professional would resell them, and Buffett would make a nice little income. Once he had that business running at age 8, he had no more to learn from it, so he hired people to do it. Of course, he had the business deal. They brought him the balls, he sold the balls and paid them. So now Buffett is looking at the age of 9. He's getting up to your age, but he's not there yet, for another business. And he hears on the radio that some people go to the racetrack and they're very impatient, and their horse is losing in the home stretch, and they get up and tear the ticket and throw it away and leave the track in disgust. And that this happens with a fair degree of frequency. Buffett has a very large canvas sack. he's at the racetrack gathering wholesale quantities of discarded tickets, and sure enough, by painstakingly comparing them to the record of the winner, he extracts an income from that, and then he hires kids to do that. He does the paperwork, the bookwork, and the cashing of the tickets, and pays. And he now has 3 streams of income, and he's 9 years old. What does he do next? It takes him a while, because like anyone with free money coming in, you know, you want to enjoy that for a while. But at age 12, he runs away from home. Now, Omaha, Nebraska is in the middle of the United States. He runs away to Washington, D.C., which is right out on the East Coast. And what does he do there? He approaches the biggest newspaper in town with an idea for a new way to circulate newspapers. He's 12 years old, and they say, let's see it work in action. Here's Buffett's method. Instead of giving a newspaper boy 80 or 90 papers, so that on a big apartment building, you might need 5 people to cover the building. And it's very hard work. I bet some of you have done it. I did it when I was a boy. Buffett says, deliver all the papers bundled to the top floor. Then he rides up on the elevator, snips the bundle, and races down the steps, throwing the papers, and gets back in the elevator, rides up, grabs them. Buffett is able single-handedly, age 12, to deliver 1,500 newspapers a day, which is a large income and his penny a paper. We're back in the 1930s now, when a lot of people don't work. Buffett becomes so good at this, the newspaper offers him the job at 15 as its circulation manager. It's a major New York newspaper, New Washington newspaper. But Buffett's not quite done yet. He has noticed when he goes to get a haircut that there's a lot of men sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting for their turn to get into the barber chair. And he says if they had something to do that would pay money, you know, here's an ideal captive audience. So he works at the idea of installing pinball machines in barber shops, cutting the tape. He'll do all the work of getting the pinball machine over to the shop. He'll take the money out and divvy it up, and he'll pay the rental on the thing and the truck carriage on the thing. He ends up with like 18 barber shops in his chain, and then he arrives at the age of 18. It's, I think, 1940, but give me a little bit of leeway either way there. He applies to America's most famous business school, the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. He has been totally supporting himself since the age of 12, and he has $100,000 in the bank, which, let me tell you, in 1940, when automobiles were a couple $1,000s each, was a lot of money, and Wharton Business School turns him down. He didn't pass the right, he didn't have the right grades to get in. That's the world's, he regained his title as world's wealthiest man about a month ago. Consider what our society would look like. Well, I was speaking when I wrote this of American society. If 65 million trapped school children learning to be consumers were suddenly set to actively imagining how to add value to the community around them, imagining themselves as producers, not consumers. Does that seem so far-fetched? In every daily Scottish newspaper and every newspaper around the world, there are major stories that if you read them very closely, you'll see a tiny little line of print that says, based on a poll taken by this or that government agency in which 300 people were interviewed. What I used to do on a regular basis with 13-year-old kids is say, you hate to be here, and I hate to be there. We can produce knowledge that's more accurate than the major newspapers by simply taking one of their polls that says candidate X will be elected by 10 points and not candidate Y, and doing 10 times the amount of statistical sampling that the paper can afford to do. And invariably, time after time, our results were substantially different than the major news stories. Let me give you one example of that. I live in a legendarily liberal part of New York City, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, between the Opera House and Columbia University. These are the people who have agitated for social change throughout my lifetime, even when I didn't live in New York City. And the belief among the upper fringes of those people is that the death penalty for serious crimes has already been abandoned by their followers, their voters. And I was quite skeptical that that was true. So I took my classes, 150 kids at the time, and I stationed them all over the West Side. I gave them some rudimentary lessons in statistical sampling, which any fifth grader can understand. And we took thousands of samples all over the West Side. And what we came to the conclusion was that this liberal community was overwhelmingly in favor of the death penalty. Its leadership was philosophically opposed to it. That kind of split between the leadership and the electorate is so common that it shouldn't surprise anyone at all. The leadership may come from the ordinary community, but they no longer are part of the ordinary community. There are a few exceptions to that, so few that there may as well be none. They become part of a virtual nation that's invisible to the people who knew them. Anyway, so my kids got that study published in the New York Times. It made me persona non grata among the leaders in the West Side. What if all the kids were turned into producers instead of consumers of knowledge? They could do both. As at present, they are exclusively consumers of what somebody else says is vital knowledge, and it hardly ever is. Past the third grade, almost all the stuff communicated is some form of propaganda or other. America got bases in Japan back in the 1860s, not by reasoning with the Japanese the way all the history books for kids in the USA. They sent gunboats over, and the gunboats announced that they would level Tokyo to the ground. And then the Japanese negotiated. They accepted the American bases. That was one of the primary causes of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Am I making that up? No, I got that directly from a major historical reference called The Japanese Imperial Conspiracy, written by the man assigned to read the secret Japanese documents after World War II. And he said the minute we did that, They made their mind up they were going to get even if it took them 100 years, and it took them 76 years. Shouldn't kids know these things, these contingencies? Shouldn't they know that no establishment could allow history to be written accurately if it portrayed the establishment in anything other than favorable terms? It isn't going to happen anywhere. Not in Great Britain, not in the United States, not in Germany. It isn't going to happen. And I'm not being cynical. Once your kid realizes that, your kid can learn historiography, how you put truth together, even though all the documents are somewhat dishonest. They're dishonest in different ways. And when you mingle them together, you can extract some approximation of what happened. I want to give you 4 more school failures. Another one of our Nobel Prize winning authors, Ernest Hemingway, was of course a school dropout. He said that all American literature can be trained to a fellow named Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. Mark Twain was his writer's name. Does Mark Twain translate into Scottish? Could you give me an idea? Okay. But Mark Twain dropped out of elementary school in 5th grade. And he created the term the Gilded Age, which historians use to frame that period of absolutely reckless public wealth. Now we have a reckless period now, but they're more discreet about demonstrating that. Mark Twain dropped out of school after 5th grade and went to work for a newspaper. He was 13 years old. Notice that magic number comes up over and over again. The year was 1848, and as I speak to you right now, that sort of blank check possibility has been foreclosed for the young everywhere. Segue now to a fellow named Robert Kiyosaki, a 4th generation Japanese American, born in Hawaii in 1946. He wrote a book some years ago called Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which was an overwhelming bestseller then and now in the United States. He had one poor grandfather, he had one poor father who was a schoolman, and he had one rich, his mother's father, who was an entrepreneur. And in Rich Dad, Poor Dad, he tries to show how the different frames of reference lead some to relative penury, although I'm dubious about whether school teachers are penurious, but nevertheless, and one to limitless wealth. So here is his background. At school, according to Robert's own report, the only courses I excelled in were lunch and football. Most people did not think I would amount to anything. At age 22, he was 3rd mate on a tramp steamer going to Tahiti. Shortly after that, he joined the Marines, stayed in the Marines for 6 years, and after a discharge, started his first business, and it failed miserably. He lost everything, including his marriage. Now he arrives at the age of 37 as a kind of ne'er-do-well. No hope, right? We all are realistic enough to know if you're a ne'er-do-well at 37, that's it. Robert's worth $60 million, I must tell you. Now, not then. So he took a course with a Harvard dropout named Buckminster Fuller, a name that will be. And Fuller taught him that the only way to learn is to be fearless about making mistakes. Learning from successful example is much inferior than learning from painful mistakes. That was the lesson he took away from Buckminster Fuller. And Kiyosaki says today, if he ever builds an education system, he'll build it around making mistakes, pushing kids into situations above their head where they make mistakes. But if they're fearless, if they're well loved, if they don't expect you to insult them or give them bad grades, the feedback mechanism, which is really the powerful educational tool, feeds back in data that allows you to correct the mistake. Not all at once, but by stages. So from penniless bankrupt to wealthy man took Robert Kiyosaki 8 years. And I would urge you to get a copy of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Many consider Robert one of the finest teachers alive in the world today, and I'm one of them. Then in the States, I don't know if it's exported, there's now a wildly successful food chain called Whole Foods Markets. Perhaps if you visited the States, you've seen them. John Mackey was the founder of those. And there's a new chain nationally called the Container Store. So when you want to move or ship stuff, all the containers that you would need are available in this one type. So rather than bring home a cardboard box from the supermarket. Those two guys roomed together in Austin, Texas, where my own son lives, and they played poker a lot by cutting college. They went to the University of Texas, but they didn't find it very rewarding, so they would miss class to play poker together, and both of them eventually dropped out. Mackey opened a health food store built around organic fruits and vegetables, and the other guy, Kip Tyndall, just announced that he was going to help people organize their messy lives. Not much of a formula for success, right? Two college dropouts with highfalutin ideas. One has a little health food store and the other one has this dream of getting rid of mess. In time, Mackey's health food store became the Whole Foods Market, America's leading natural food emporium, and Tyndall's dream became the Container Store, a unique national chain without any competition. Both men found a way to add value to the world around them after they dropped out. I don't think that's such an onerous thing to teach your kids over and over again. If you aren't useful to other people, then you're useless. I mean, it's a simple equation. Treating customers as if they matter more than profit was the dream these two poker players had when they were sitting in their barren room in Austin, Texas. They conceived a business idea where profit would be secondary to being useful to the world around them. That came first, no matter what it cost. Profit came second. Is it any wonder that their businesses are successful? I got a letter about 4 years ago from a 16-year-old kid in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's a short letter. I'd like to read it to you. Dear Mr. Gatto, compulsory schooling suppresses the evolution of concepts and practices. It turns over natural priorities. Instead of offering useful stuff or focusing on self-mastery, it concentrates on test scores. but tests can be passed without learning anything at all except how to trick the system. Now contrast the internet. If I want something esoteric like number theory, I don't have to wait for college. I don't have to buy books written for some theoretically average student where everyone knows average people don't exist. They're a fantasy in some bureaucrat's head. Learning doesn't have to be that way. As soon as I Google number theory, my study begins. I design a curriculum that fits me. And as I do that, I gain deeper insight into the concept. I ask in a forum, and many people answer. Standardized schooling cannot adapt this way. It can't provide the depth of content or the quality of assistance. Imagine a 16-year-old Oklahoma kid. I couldn't write this compactly. Schooling has become irrelevant to learning. The day of the expert and of an elite created by rationing information and using the power of government to load the dice has reached a crisis, and I don't think it's going to recover. Our existing contracts between ourselves and the young don't work anymore. Quit enriching the Disney Corporation by drowning your kid in funny animals. And by keeping your kids' children, parents make enemies of their own children. It's just as clear to me as night and day, sometimes lifelong enemies. A young French poet who I'm told his name is pronounced Ruenzel, is that right? We have a French teacher here. 100 years ago, he saw the future this way. He said, "This is the time of the sweat bath, of oceans boiling over, of underground explosions, of the planet whirled away, of extermination sure to follow. Listen, we're in the time of the sweat bath. Would you prefer as your personal ally an A student with high standardized test scores, or a walkabout like Richard Branson, a valedictorian, or a surf bum like Craig Venter? Formula schooling is worthless to citizens, even destructive. It's only useful to policymakers and managers by removing your competence. It must be killed, not modified. Attempts to tinker with its ruthless formula prolongs our social agony and makes the situation worse. You reach into the public bazaar and there's wisdom and guidance aplenty. Yes, it will take courage, but you people have already demonstrated that courage. But I don't expect leadership to come from any political direction. Professionalism itself functions as a hardening of the social arteries. Its limited utility comes at far too high a price that has to be charged against what really matters. The human dream, but the dream realized in 19th century America was, and this is the ideal, so realized differentially, in part, was you made your own shelter, you made your own clothing, you made your own food, you made your own entertainment, you made your own education. And the people who derive from that tradition, usually small farmers, the people who are absolutely superior, not at winning contests in life, but in living a good, solid, happy, successful life and transmitting that sense of self-reliance to their children. Anyone who tells you that education is about getting a good job is not your friend. As I was writing this originally, I heard on the radio an interview with a young girl returning to Virginia Tech. That's the scene of the greatest school shooting massacre in our history. The college was closed for a while, but she was now going back to the college. And the interviewer asked her, "What excites you most about going back to college?" And she said, "Why, taking my final examinations, of course." And the interviewer was puzzled. He said, "That's odd, why that?" And she said, "Why, to see if I learned anything, of course." I would submit to you that that young woman will never be a problem for any important special interest, or any use to the rest of us or herself when trouble comes and there's nobody around to assign a grade to her work. And in conclusion, we've got about 6 minutes, maybe 7. Has anybody here heard of the Dutch city of Drachten? It's spelled D-R-A-C-H-T-E-N. It's a lovely little city of about 25,000. And I hope you can see how the Drachten experience of just a few years ago dovetails with what I've been trying to say today. Drachten, very prosperous place. Everybody had an automobile or 2 or 3. It had a ghastly traffic problem. Nothing moved in the town. There were many, many accidents as impatient drivers tried to jump the traffic signs and lights. What was Drachten's solution to its problem? Again, if you lived 1,000 years, you could hardly imagine it because of the way you and I have been schooled. Drachten eliminated all traffic lights and all traffic signs. Traffic accidents immediately fell in half as the driver became aware, that his beloved baby was at risk of, losing a fender. Fell in half. As people worked out signals with one another, as they worked out signals of who takes a turn first, takes a turn second, the traffic jams cleared up in Drachten. In other words, the wisdom of the commons was much greater than the wisdom of the traffic engineer, the expert. And I don't know how religious an audience this is, although I know if I went back 100 years, you'd all be Presbyterian. But I want to conclude with a lesson I took from the letters of St. Paul in the New Testament. And don't think I'm trying to convert any of you, but there's a real lesson here. Paul's New Testament letters to the congregations, which much later became the Christian movement, were a revelation to me when I read them last summer. They show that this question of whether we should think for ourselves or not, turn it over to expert, has been with mankind for a very long time. In Paul's day, the society was intensely rule-bound. If any of you have ever seen the book, the Mishnah, there are rules for anything you could imagine there's a rule for. There's a rule for how high you have to stand when you pour water on a manure pile, what rung of the ladder. So the Mishnah is worth picking up just for kind of insight into this tendency of the human mind. Anyway, in Paul's day, rules were there for everything, and too much bureaucracy had ruined the quality of ordinary life. Leadership had been lost by too many bureaucrats enforcing rules, and society required officials to watch the officials, and so on ad infinitum. Paul told the various scattered congregations, he says this over and over, it's unmistakable, you cannot find salvation by following the rules. Set aside the religious context, and what you have is the school problem of our own day. It's a conflict between interest groups whose income and status derives from keeping things pretty much as they are, and an insurgency, like the homeschooling community, whose ideas have been overlooked by management. Paul tells the insurgency 2,000 years ago to make up the rules as you go along. He said, if you only keep to the core principle of love and adapt that to local conditions, remembering that that includes loving your enemies, things will always work out, he says. The political establishment of Paul's day thought everything, no matter how small, could be contained by a rule. There were rules for thousands of situations. Management was committed to absolute certainty. 2,000 years ago, that meant this: find a thief, cut off his nose. Find an adulteress, stone her to death. When in doubt, do not think, follow the rules. Some modern analogs might be, of course attendance has to be compulsory. What would they do except cause trouble if we did not force them to attend? And we must believe the results of standardized tests. It would be insane to trust our own judgment. Keep the Dutch city of Drachten in mind as you think about that. But the insurgency of Paul's day, that today we call Christianity, said things incomprehensible to rule book people, and I'm afraid to say incomprehensible to most Christians today. They said, if somebody steals your coat, give him your cloak too. If somebody strikes you on one side of your face, turn the other side to be struck. Pay the workmen who labor only for the afternoon the same wage as those who work all day long. Forced schooling legislation and classroom routines have visited the rule-choked environment of Paul's day and visited it upon us. Through the interlocking rules of schooling, colleges, and corporations, three heads on the very same serpent, common society has been divided from its own best interest. It has been trivialized and made childish. It has been disenfranchised. Command and control formulae are everywhere. We have become a surveillance society in which more than one job out of every 5 involves snooping on the behavior of others. Here's something you may not know, because I know there are close ties between Scotland and the United States. It is 6 times more likely that you will end up in prison in the United States than it is in communist China. When you get alone, repeat that mantra to yourself silently 6 times. 6 times more likely you'll go to jail in the U.S. than in China. That fact alone should cause all of us to repudiate the road we are on and the road schooling has established to keep us on that road. And with that, I'm going to conclude, even though I could keep you here for a lot longer. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.